Okay, so we're gonna talk about a topic. I guess I just call it this. I feel like this came about because of that something to do with language is magic
Yeah, I was gonna
comment I
actually,
made.
yeah, I was gonna actually kind of do a little intro because
I'm sorry. Could you repeat yourself? My
Michael,
my computer just went
oh
freaked
yeah,
out for a second.
I was gonna do a little intro because I feel like this kind of falls on me to do.
Okay,
I don't remember what conversation it was you were having. Maybe it was the McGilchrist one or something.
we were talking
Um,
about the Vervaeke Peterson conversation.
oh, okay. And at one point during the conversation, you said you went on a little rant, and then you said language is magic. You know, that was part of the rant. But that's the thing that just shone to me. It just stood out because I have had a more negative perspective on language. I've I've always, and I know this sounds like completely ironic, but because people tell me all the time I articulate myself really well, but I always feel like I'm limited by my language, right? And that language has made me feel like in the poor ways that I try to articulate myself, I end up feeling unheard or misunderstood most of the time, right? And to be really vulnerable and honest, it's been um, it's been my dream and my hope that one day I can say what I think, right? That I can actually, because I want to be included, right? I don't want to feel like the outsider. I don't want to feel like I'm being misunderstood. And then I'm, necessarily left alone, right? I feel alone. And so language hasn't been my friend. But when you said language is magic, I thought, oh no, there's something there. So that's kind of what prompted this conversation. And I'm eager to hear. And I like, this is not a debate. I'm not going to debate you because I think that you're right, but I need to understand it. So maybe we could dig into that. What you
Yeah.
said.
Well, I mean, for me, there was kind of a long genesis for that me making that statement, or I guess the proper would be actually genealogy. Like I mean, I can remember going like this happened to me maybe 10 years ago, something of that nature, where and this was a time in my life where I wasn't really in tune with any sort of like I'd kind of sort of rejected whatever Christianity my parents had bequeathed to me. And I I still had a curiosity and a sense that there was something there I didn't understand, but I didn't have any patience to really dig into that. But I remember I was driving somewhere and I could still remember this exact, and it was almost like this thought just popped into my head. And for whatever reason, I took it really deadly seriously. And I remember, I think I even pulled over my car because I was driving and like, and had some, involved reflections on it.
It was an
Um,
epiphany, Michael. Just admit it. An epiphany.
yeah. But yeah, it was, but even that statement, that the fact that this thing comes out of nowhere is,
Mhm.
and it came to me in the form of language, right? And it completely arrested my attention and my focus. Um, and it just, it was, I was in a very materialist frame of mind at that point in my time, and yet I couldn't deny that that was a true statement.
Mhm.
And so what did I mean by magic? I didn't really know what I meant by that either, but it seemed, I knew there was a lot of depth there that, it was like, seeing just sort of like the glint of gold, off in the distance, and knowing that that's the direction I should be going. um and yeah, so it's something I find myself repeatedly thinking about. There's, another thing that I'm tend to get really amped about, or like I tend to use as a kind of lens for understanding things, is this idea of data compression, um, which, it's kind of boringly links into my background working with technology and stuff. So it's like but I feel like it's more than that, because for me, this idea of data compression has to be present if there is some meaningful articulation or participation rather between the infinite and the finite. There has to be something that is able to meaningfully take from the very large and represent it in something that's small enough that you or I can handle without it, breaking us. And it seems like language is such a key component of this. In me and Cal and Matthew just recently had a really long conversation where we were going through some things, and one of the things, the sticking points for me and Cal was like, he's really persuaded by this Chris Langdon guy and some of his ideas called the CTMU, which is a very thorough and exhaustive quote unquote theory of everything, which is, I don't I don't really know how to even try and take it apart and understand it. But for me, I have a natural inclination to say, well, no, we can't really, there's limits to what we can do with language. So I think that's more kind of what you would probably be on that side.
Yeah.
But and Cal came back with me later, like a day later on a Vox, and was like saying or a message over Vox. He was saying that, well, if you can articulate the question, then in theory you could know the answer to. And I think, but I don't think that's right, because we can ask questions like, what is the meaning of life? And that in that word meaning is just layer upon layer upon layer upon layer of data compression. It's just it's like a Russian doll that doesn't ever have any exhaustage to it. So like within that, you just kind of explode, anything that could really, I mean, you can point to it with certain things, but to get to like some like defined pattern for the quote unquote meaning of life, it's not really, you live a life hopefully that has some resemblance to that, but you can't ever answer the question really, right?
Well, that seems like it gets to that idea of Vervaeke's of combinatorially explosive and relevance realization, right? Like you have to choose something. I think Peterson makes that same point where he says, if everything was relevant, you'd go crazy. Like you'd be lost. You'd actually be in chaos, right? Because I mean, that's what chaos is. It's potential. It's the potential of everything, right? And so if you were completely aware of what was in the chaos, this is why, the story of creation is so interesting, because God is pulling something that's relevant out of the chaos one at a time, kind of there and there, but it comes out of one thing, right? It comes out of the chaos. It's all connected. But he's making certain things relevant. And the idea of this Russian doll and data compression is really interesting, because I've been listening to Margaret Barker, and she's talking about the tabernacle and the Holy of Holies, and that is God in the midst of his creation, right? Which shows that is his heart. He wants to be in the midst of his creation. And I went to bed and I woke up, and first thing in the morning, this thought went across my mind, and I thought, well, that's kind of obvious, but I'll say it anyway. Was okay, this is why the Jews were chosen. This is why they were chosen, because they were a data compression of sorts, right? It was the big story in shorthand. I mean, I don't know how many thousands of years before God chose Abraham, right? That he was still everywhere present, filling all things. He had relationships with Noah, he had relationships with Enoch, he had all these, Adam, right? But somehow the story was too diluted. It was too big. And it couldn't be relevant to everyone at once, right? So he data compressed it into one group of people. And I just thought, oh, that, that is really interesting to me, because it helps me to get away from the fact that, yes, the Jewish people are chosen and they are God's people. But at the same time, they had no choice in the matter, right? And it hasn't been easy for them. I'm sure, like I've heard many a Jew say, you don't want to be one of us. You don't want to be chosen by God, you know? And so, yeah, that made them really vulnerable. But they were also the arena in which God told his story, right? The big story that was spread out over the entire earth, all of creation, suddenly got compressed into this one group of people. Anyway, what do you think of that?
I think that's really good. I mean, yeah, I've always had a certain there's something about the Jewish story that at every layer throughout the entire history, like there's just something always interesting going on there. That you're right, it's a compression. It's a, if you like, in modernity we would call it a shortcut, but it's
well, in that Margaret Barker video, she's shown well that the tabernacle, the temple itself, is the story of creation, day by day, and God is in the midst, right?
Yeah.
Like just that alone, Michael.
Oh, that was huge. I mean, what gets at that whole kind of nature versus grace divide that we were talking about in the the POS theology conversation, where oh man, there's just so much going on here.
Well, let me try to hone it down, because we were talking about language as data compression, and then I thought of that. Part of the reason I mentioned it too was because there wasn't a lot of language going on there. Like, okay, so I'm gonna steelman my argument for a minute, because it was all imagery, right? It was a house. It was a holy of holies. It was a veil. It was a candlestick. It was an ark. It was cherubims. It was certain woods and certain metals and certain people and certain times of the year, right? The story was told in the fashioning of the tabernacle. It wasn't a book to read in the tabernacle. It wasn't a library, right, of words. But at the same time, it was through the images. Mm-hmm. So, and I guess, well, this could
but the language is how we know about it now. I mean,
right?
Like yes. There's something. Well, and why did that survive? Well, because the language compresses down to these books that can be actually copied. Mm-hmm. So there's something about that. There's this again, going back to the shortcut, there's something about allowing something to continue into the future in this sort of shorthand way. But again, you have to come back to it with the right set of eyes and a sort of loving gaze to take this like little data compression and expand it back out into something meaningful. And you can choose not to do that with the text. You can, you can have the opposite of loving gaze. You see it as some sort of instrument for doing what you want to do, whatever that is. Mm-hmm. Which tons of people interact with it that way. and there's all these kind of levels in between of where we kind of successfully, because at some point, to interact with a text at all, you have to, at the beginning, you have to have very kind of instrumental goals of very narrow focus. If nothing, otherwise you don't start down that path. But the problem is you have to, like I think we were talking about the other day, the concern is when you stop short, where you say, okay,
Mhm.
I have a full understanding of this now, and I don't need to dig any deeper. I don't need to have
There's
any
no
of my,
mystery
there's
here.
no mystery, and there's no mystery where as it relates to core assumptions about what's going on here.
Yeah.
Um,
Well, we've
but
talked about, oh, go ahead.
I was just gonna say, I think your idea where you're talking about silence is really important. But because I think I think silence is an important part of language. It's an important part of communication. I mean,
It's
you
the,
can't listen without being silent, and not only just you, because I see a problem today when a lot of conversations are happening. I even struggle with this, like where when you're listening to somebody, but you're really kind of you're thinking about how you're going to respond, or where you want the conversation to go, or the things that you would like to present, or how to frame or understand something, so you can do some sort of, again, instrumental goal that you want to move towards. But that interferes with your ability to really take in and be formed and shaped by the activity of the language that's coming at you from the other person.
right. I mean, if you think about it from a purely, sociological or biological point of view, you're basically just a soft little putty thing with tons of sensory, little nodules all over you, right? You got your eyes, your ears, your tongue, your nose, your nerves on your skin, and you're taking everything in all the time, right? And I mean, this is what dreaming is. This is you going to bed and then processing all the things that you took in that day or earlier, right? And I mean, I can only speak from my own experience that I put myself in positions of silence for utilitarian reasons. Like I go walking with my goats. They need to eat. I need to walk. Let's do this together, kind of thing. But then who am I going to talk to? I have no one to talk to. I mean, I can talk to my dog. I can talk to my goat, but not for very long, right? And so then you're just silent. And like I've had to, since joining the Discord and being involved in so many conversations, I've had to, disentangle myself. I've really felt like, okay, I got to get away from this. I need to go shovel some dirt or, turn my compost or whatever. I need my silence, because that's where everything gets processed, right? And that's, the brain is made of synapses, which are basically connections. And that's where you make your connections, right? You make them in the silence. And so, yeah, silence is, I don't think that what we're doing right now is wrong at all. But it's wrong to think that it's the means to an end, if that makes any sense. Because
elaborate a little bit on that.
Yeah, well, because what we're doing is we're veiling and unveiling, okay? Like I'm unveiling something to you, but when you get it, it's veiled because you have your own perspective And then you need to unveil it, right? And that's not going to happen in this conversation. It might happen. And when it does, it's always really amazing, right? Then that's when everybody's eyes lights up and they all have this moment of communion, actually, where they feel like their consciousness has connected to somebody else's. But generally speaking, it doesn't happen. It happens later when all of that data that you're exchanging with each other has an opportunity to connect with some of the things that you've already, or that you've long since thought. That's what I think. And then, and this is why having ongoing dialogues is so important, because then you can say, oh, guess what I thought of? And what do you think? And then, and so what am I trying to say? Everything is an image to me. So it's kind of like we are like the synapses of a giant brain, right?
Yeah.
And we're funneling bits of information and trying to connect them. It's I mean, I don't know, I haven't read much Jung, but it's probably what he considered collective consciousness. I don't know. Is that what he's thinking when he says that?
I don't know. I don't honestly, I don't know Jung enough.
Mm-hmm.
He's kind of scary to me.
Yeah, me too.
I do think he's interesting, but I feel like he feels dangerous to me in the way that certain postmodern thought feels dangerous to me, because it feels like
it's too
it's
ridiculous.
it's a very powerful method of construing things, but it seems like it's when you become engrossed in it, it kind of has the capacity to kind of blot everything else out. So you suddenly can't see everything else. And then you're kind of lost in it. And it feels so real that it's, it's kind of overwhelming and terrifying in its own respect. Man, I had, this is my brain all the time wants to do like go down 3 paths at once. And I want to go down each of them because I have a sort of feeling that if I go down each of them, I'm going to find out how they're really meeting back at some point down the road. That's more significant than any one of them by themselves. Okay, so like for me, again, where I think I'm not like when I get in conversations like this, I think there's always like in this certain time period where we always want to appear smart and like we have something valuable to say. And so for me, I have the pull of that on the one hand, but on the other hand, I feel like the really interesting and meaningful things are going in the opposite direction.
Right.
And so like,
I know you're smart.
And I don't know how to navigate that because, anyway, so I'll just say one thing. Like, I do think there's something we achieve in the data compression of creating a sort of like, because when I think of like a narrative, like a story, I think of that what all that is the data compression, right? Yeah. And what it is, for instance, like if I ask you, like, what did you do yesterday? Out of nowhere, you're going to give me a very compressed, 5, 10 minute, 15-minute version of what you did yesterday. It's not going to include like details of like tying your shoes or like, all these little things, right? You're somehow going to know you have this kind of hierarchy of filters. There you go. Okay. It's going to pass through all of them in a second. And you're going to say, oh, well, I did this, and this. And, and for some reason, those are for you, the milestones or the hallmarks of your story for that day. And it just fascinates me how that can be just like that. Yeah. But I think we're doing it all the time. Like even I think probably the structure of the brain is very much doing the same thing all the time. So even if I'm doing something like some procedural thing, like I'm going to drive my car, or I'm going to get out of my car and walk into my house and unlock the keys. Like there's so much of those processes, I think, are represented in the brain in this sort of linear fashion of things. And really what that linear line is doing is telling me, when you get to this point in the story, here's the salient features.
Yeah.
You can ignore everything else,
Yeah.
but when you put the key into the lock, there's these very, and they're tactile sensations of like, okay, when you hit this point, you got to
Yeah.
turn it a little bit like that because you have a funny, your lock's funny, or like,
Yeah.
and for somebody else coming into it, like they fumble with it forever, but you have done it a million times and exactly, as I follow this line, here's where the path is.
Yeah.
Through all the noise, here's where the path is to get through it. And I think that's why we really value good storytelling, because that somebody is doing that they're doing it on a level that is applicable. It's like a path that isn't just specific to you or I, but it's a path that potentially is valuable or relevant to like millions of people. And there's something like that means they've hit on something in some way that's more key. So like when I was creating the Google Docs for, prepping for our conversation, because I was hopeful I could just read stuff that would help feed the conversation. But one of the things they were talking about, like, with kids and trying to measure kids like reading comprehension, and how there's not really a good way to do that, because there's no quote unquote reading skill that you can measure. What you're really measuring is people's previous interactions with the particular vocabulary that you're presenting them in this material. And that's nobody has there's no sort of universal way you can do that. Like if you're a science geek and the article has words about science, you're going to be able to comprehend that in ways that somebody who isn't won't. Right. And so and there was a line I highlighted in there that said, what we consider good writing is always about trying to leave out as much as possible and just give you the kind of salient little bits, because otherwise it's tedious, right? You want to figure out, like, there's all these other things that you can assume, and in some sense that you assuming that is you being silent about those things,
right?
So you're silent about all these other things, and I'm going to just weave this very thin line and say, hey, dear reader, come follow me along this line.
So is it you think it's apophatic in a way?
I think good writing is, and that's why I think, with you want an example of bad writing, go to Microsoft's website and find one of their technical documents that tells you how to do something. Oh my God, it's so bad. And it's not even really written from the perspective, because oftentimes it's written by someone that's a technical writer, and I feel like that actually makes the writing worse, because they're trying to like technically include every parameter and every correct notion. And it's just, oh man, it's so jargon intensive, and so like, oh my, it's beyond bad. It's like, and I'm a person that lives enough in that world that I should understand most of the things. But for me, like, it's so much work to get through. And so you kind of just drowned in like this sea of trivial data points. Like that's just like nothing.
It's the so-called blah, blah, blah.
Yeah. Like you can't, I could be in a mode where, like, okay, I know within this document, there's some information that is very important to things I'm trying to accomplish over here. And I still can't make myself pay attention to, because it's like so bad,
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. It's, and it's the particular job that I work in has made me really bad at reading, because I'm so often dealing with documents that are of this sort of ilk that I'm in the habit of not really reading, but kind of scanning.
Yeah.
Like, don't try to read it. because you're gonna waste too much time. Just look
Looking for
for
certain
that.
words.
Yeah, exactly. Look for certain combinations of
Yeah,
words in relative proximity to one another, and then now start reading a
yeah,
little bit. So for me, like when I read good books, I often have to play tricks with myself where like I either have to read it out loud or I have to listen to it on tape while I'm reading, looking at it, and to
to
make myself
slow it down.
stay exactly. And that rhythm of the language and the pausing and all that stuff, that's a certain there's a
Yeah,
certain music there
yes.
that you have to have a trust for the author before you're willing to look at to follow along with that music.
Yeah, well, it may be more of even a commitment to go with him,
And
right?
and often what I find, like say like in a novel or something like that, it say like the first 25 or 35% of the book, it's a lot of work because
Yeah,
I at that point I still don't really trust. But at
yeah,
some point you like there's like a shift that happens and it's like, okay, now I'm in this world. I
yeah.
trust that the author knows what they're doing and that like, they've set the stakes for a story that I'm like, okay, now I'm in.
Well,
I'm bought in.
I think that often ties in too with a moment of unveiling. Like, so the author his intent is veiled in the beginning of the book, right? He's setting a stage or introducing characters or whatever the case might be. But you keep, especially in this day and age, and I don't read technical documents, but just the internet, just looking up Wikipedia stuff. I'm doing that too, right?
Mm.
And when I get a book in my hands, I have to go, okay, remember that place where you used to curl up in your bed and read for hours? That's where we're going now, you know? And untrain that, we talked about this yesterday, right? With the hurrying up, right? The intensity of our time, of the Aramonic.
Mhm.
Really, really fighting against that. But then there's a moment in the book, and I had this with when I read Piranesi. I was like, okay, what
Did
is
you
this?
read it in just a
I read
physical
it.
book?
I did.
Yeah.
And um, and then all of a sudden I turned the page and the veil was lifted, and I was like, oh, I'm all in, and then
What
and then
point
it
in the
was
book was
over
it? Do you
with.
remember? Do you remember what was happening then?
It was almost a third of the way in, at least.
Yeah.
I don't
That's my
remember.
experience. It's usually at least that far into the book.
Yeah, yeah, a third of the way in. Yeah, and I've never read like easy reading novels. Like I shouldn't say I've never read them. I have read them, but I like the more difficult things, right? I read
Mhm.
The Idiot by Fyodor Dostoevsky, so please. I was like,
Did you read that recently? Oh, that's a really good one.
no, I read it 1997 when we moved to Telegraph Creek, and it was my winter project. I went and grabbed a whole bunch. We had a share shed. Someone had dropped off a big stack of Dostoevsky books, and I just scooped them up and said, this is my winter project. And The Idiot was one that I was like, I don't know what I'm doing. I don't know where I am. I don't know what I'm reading. I should read it again, actually. It
Yeah.
was very difficult for me. And
It's got that famous line, "Beauty will save the world." It comes from that novel.
oh, is it? Oh, I didn't realize that. Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Well,
It's funny because it's like a throwaway line though from one of the characters. I don't even think it's a main character that says it. But it's he often does that. He often has like characters come into, and it seems like it clearly is just he wants somebody to muse out loud about something that's of interest to him.
well, isn't that though, like if we draw this back to the beginning of the conversation, isn't that your epiphany moment? Isn't that just some weird like character
Hmm.
who
Yeah.
just speaks magic into your life? That's what that is,
Yeah.
you know. It's kind of like the metaphor, from the mouths of babes, right?
Well,
Just,
you just made a point there too, that like there's something about personifying things that actually turns on a more involved engagement with something.
yeah.
This kind of goes back to like, remember like when Paul way back when was big into like the spirit of geometry versus the spirit of finesse.
Yeah.
And so like when we deal with persons, we have this spirit of finesse because there's there's a sort of recognition of the magnitude of the thing we're interacting with, such that we can't press buttons on people,
Mhm.
and or we can't program them to do the things we want them to do. Although sometimes we often try to treat people that way, and that's often, I think, a big part of why there's relationship strife. I actually think that the people we often know and love the best, or know, we're most likely to do that too, because
Well, we
at
make a
least
lot of
for
assumptions about what they know.
exactly, we think, I've known this person this long. If they give this look, or they use
Yeah.
this word with this tone of voice, I know exactly what they mean, and this is really their hidden motive or whatever.
Yeah.
And yeah, it's not
But
very
it's
helpful.
interesting though that the words behind that, like in that situation where you're assuming something about someone, the words are embodied. Like you're taking your cues from the body too, right? Like not just the words. This is
Yeah,
why text is so difficult,
yeah,
because you don't have the body behind the words, right? You can't discern the tone, the emphasis, the pause, like the
yeah.
silence, right? Um, yeah, and I mean, I'm just thinking about language itself, like how tied up it is in our bodies,
I'm curious, you going back to the start where you feel like language is this stumbling block.
Mhm.
How do you think? Because you talked about being misunderstood and feeling kind of outside of things, which I feel like that's kind of my experience too. Like I feel like I've always felt like an outsider. I've always kind of been hesitant to speak about things because of fear of being misunderstood, or um but at the same time I still feel like um I still feel like language is magic, and that there is a certain thing I can enter into that I'm not good at, but is actually still there. And a big part of it being there is my willingness to be vulnerable, my willingness to like believe that it's there, and kind of trust something outside of myself to kind of,
Get to it.
yeah, to get to it, but also to kind of capture and sort of magnify what my little intention is trying to achieve, and kind of actually bring it into some real fruition of some sort. Um
Well,
and
oh, sorry.
no,
Um,
go ahead.
um, I have realized since we've talked about this a little bit outside of this conversation, that I think I can be more specific. And the reason I wasn't before was because I didn't see the distinction, but I think I can be more specific and say that propositional language is more
Mhm.
restorative,
Yeah,
because I also am a poet, right? And I enter into fairyland when I write poetry, when I read poetry as well, right? And maybe this goes to unity and multiplicity, because poetry has the power, if you will, a magical power of speaking to you on various levels, because it's all encompassing, right? It's kind of a holistic way of communicating something.
Yeah. I like to think of like good poetry is sort of like a photograph of consciousness. Like it's got all these parameters that link to like the sense stuff we were talking about earlier, all this, all the stuff that's coming into me from a sensory perspective, but also not just that, but the way it forms meaning inside me. And a really good poem enables somebody to kind of feel something of a fraction of what it first inspired the poem in the reader.
Yeah, but then again, they might not even, that they might feel like they understand what the writer was saying, but they might not even, like I've talked to poets and I said, oh, this is fantastic, so this is relating. No, that I wasn't writing about that at all.
Yeah.
And you're like, but see, this happened to me once recently where I wrote a poem and I was writing specifically about, I have this poem that I'm supposed to edit. It's an old one of mine, right? And every time I go to edit it, I can't.
Yeah.
And it's like it's alive. And it's got all these little poison darts, and it's just like every time I go near it, it's like, no, don't touch me, And I thought, what is going on? So I wrote a poem about that, right?
Mm-hmm.
And then afterwards I read it and I was like, oh my God, this is that. But it was a perfect description of what just happened to my husband when he collapsed. It was so weird, Michael. And then a couple months later, I went through a very difficult time and I read that poem again and it was prophetic. And I was like, wait a minute. Because I wrote the poem when my husband was admitted to hospital. Okay. I wrote the poem about my poem when, like 2 days after he collapsed. So it was actually hitting on the past, the present, and the future all in one poem. And it taught me something about poetry. So at the same time that I'm writing this thing, I'm also learning what poetry is actually doing. Mm-hmm. It's like I tapped in, like I plugged into this, ground of being. What I mean? That's what it felt like. And it really blew me away, because when I read it, right after I wrote it, I did see the present. I saw the past and the present, but I didn't see the future until it hit. And just by chance, in the midst of something, I read it and I was like, oh my God, this is also the future. And I wasn't looking for it, like it just presented itself that way. So yeah, back to my, thing about language. I feel myself shifting. And I have also told you that I really there's some things that I want to do with language, but because of my perception of language as being something that divides, mm-hmm. I don't want to utilize it, right? I don't know how to utilize it outside of poetry, let's say. And I think for me, poetry feels more like a channeling exercise. Like I'm not writing it, something else is writing it. That's what it feels like. So, but if I were to apply myself, let's say I want to write a novel, which I do actually, I want to write a book. As soon as I do that, it's like that poem that needs to be edited. I'm afraid of it, right? Because of maybe the aloneness that I felt, or the division, it divides me from everything else. Yeah, and when you said that language is magic, I knew that was right. And I guess I wanted to understand how, because I think that's key for me personally. I think it's key in unlocking this this thing that's keeping me from, let's say, editing my poem,
Yeah.
right?
Well, I think you're right. I mean, the fear is proper in some sense, but it's I think there's something good about the part of you that has this sort of fear or this sort of apprehension about it. But
there's also a cost, right, to
yeah.
writing.
Oh yeah. Like, I mean, like, I do think in some sense, if you're gonna, whether it's a poem or a novel, a story of characters, like there's supreme sacrifices that have to come about in you to do that
Mhm.
and to do it well. And I think in some measure that's how we measure the quality of a work, is the degree to which that's been done. Like, we
Yeah.
somehow can know it. Like, there's certain, like, say in a Dostoevsky novel, there's so many things that show up in there's such a richness and a depth to things that you realize came at a deep cost.
Mhm.
A certain attention to detail and a certain yeah, and that makes you, one of the things it does is it helps you trust the author.
Yeah.
Like you're saying, you have to get to that kind of 30% point, and the author demonstrates a certain consistency with these things, and you're kind of, now you're in. You're like,
Yeah.
Yep, I trust that this author is going to do this to the end.
Yeah.
Like, I can tell in some of these little details tell me, oh man, she or he needs the conclusion of this to be as best as it possibly can be, more than I even do, so I can trust them.
Yeah.
And so I want to see what they're going to do with it, because now you're like, okay, I don't, man, it's this. Go ahead.
Well, I'm just thinking, is that a kind of vulnerability on the part of the author? Like,
Yeah, I mean,
yeah.
there's what's Karen on her channel, when she used to talk about some book, I can't remember. I think it's called Art and Fear. But yeah,
Yeah.
like, I think anytime you make something, like, yeah, there's something, you're exposing something of yourself. And that, yeah. And
I
there's a,
had, maybe I'll talk about this because this kind of related. Well, it's very definitely related. And this was a learning curve for me when it came to language as well, because like I said, I always felt like, outside or misunderstood or whatever. And I had this brain injury, and my expression became very childlike, because, well, first of all, I couldn't really formulate a big argument or anything like that. And secondly, I had a very low threshold for expressing myself. So, if something struck me as funny, I would laugh.
yeah,
And it would be inappropriate sometimes, or I would cry and it would also be inappropriate. But I also would say inappropriate things, right? And this is totally normal when you have a brain injury. It's not totally normal otherwise, but and I found myself really struggling with vulnerability, but I also saw the magic in it. Okay. Because sometimes there was a few times in my relationship to my kids and my husband where something would happen and I would just, like a little kid, I would say what I was feeling, just like, I don't know, I can't even think of an example, but it would just come out like one of those, like out of mouths of babes, this thing would come out, and they would look at me and they would immediately understand exactly where I was standing. It was like they entered into my consciousness, right? And the strange thing about it, Michael, was that it was very basic, really basic things, like a little kid that says, you know, you make me mad, you know. and these are the things that we don't want to say as adults, right? Because
Well,
it shows too much of what's going on inside.
yeah, we gesture at it, but we often try to kind of hedge our bets by making it not about us and about some quote unquote objective reality that's
Yeah, or
outside of
that,
us.
you know, or that really hurt my feelings.
Mhm.
Just little funny things like that. And then all of a sudden the listener would reciprocate with something like, I never knew that. I never knew that's how it made you feel, you know? And then there was this empathy that happens, right? When you're vulnerable. And I think empathy is in a sense, it's a deep connection between two people, right?
Right.
Like you're actually in their shoes. It's one of those moments, you know. And but anyway, I was just thinking about that because of the idea of vulnerability on the part of the author. Maybe that's what it is. It creates a kind of empathy between you and the author, and then you can enter in, right? Like you're actually standing in their shoes.
Yeah. There's this book that's really influenced me. I don't know. I may have mentioned this before in a conversation we've talked before previously, but it's called The Chosen by it's by this he was actually a Jewish rabbi. I think he was an Orthodox rabbi, but he also had a background in philosophy, and I think he at some point he was a college teacher as well. But his name was Chaim Potok, and this book, you know, it's mainly a book. I guess it's a book about fathers and sons, but and these two kids that become friends. That one's from a Hasidic background, and the other one's from like a more like reformed, you know, Jewish background. So his dad is um he's still Orthodox, but like, you know, reformed, like not
Yeah.
as stringent as like the Hasids. And the one who's the son of the Hasidic rabbi, his you know, he's a genius, and he can, like, you know, he's got like a memory that he can like memorize the Talmud, you know, like he can do it in an instant and quote everything. And it's kind of expected that he's going to take over for his father to become the leader of their community, because it's like the rabbis in those communities are kind of dynastic, like, so it's like it's gone back centuries with
Yeah.
a family. And this kind of thing gets introduced where you find out that the father of the Hasidic rabbi, he doesn't talk to his son unless they're studying the Torah together or doing
Mm.
Talmud. And um and for some reason, to me, that the silence between them, I felt was this really kind of it became this sort of really important representation for me between God's silence and us.
Mm.
And
Interesting.
yeah, and there's this kind of famous line towards the end of the book where he's telling his son about why he chose to take this method. I guess it's something kind of like, there's a tradition of this in the Hasidic community. They call it like silence, and it's um and or I don't remember what they called it, um but he's not even telling. So his son's name's Danny, but his friend Reuven comes over, and he's actually talking to Reuven, but he's really, because he doesn't talk to Danny. so he won't talk to him directly, but he's talking to Reuben to his son
For
through
him. Yeah.
yeah. And he's explaining why he does this, and like, he wants, because his part of it's because his son's a genius and he wants his son to learn compassion. And so it's like he's kind of introduced this sort of strain of this silence so that he will know what pain and suffering is, so he can have compassion, and like he can be a better leader. For what's funny is that the son ends up deciding not to become the rabbi. He wants to do something else. But and he at the very end of it all, he says, a wise father may have done something differently, but I'm not wise.
Mm.
And for me, for some reason, like I don't know. Like, yeah, I can barely talk about it because like I feel like I'm gonna cry. But it's like I felt like
You think that, so you were talking about the silence. Like previously you talked about the silence being important, and this kind of apophatic storytelling. And I'm just trying to tie this together, and then this father exercising this kind of silence with his son in order to cultivate something. But in the end, he admits that it might not have been the wisest thing to do. So
for me, like it speaks to all the suffering in the world, that there's this I don't know, like I get the feeling, and again, like I have so many heretical views on this, so I kind of hold them in some sort of tension. Like I don't like,
just go for it.
but like it's almost like, God in making us gives, in some sense, the silence is God's retreat. And instead of telling us what to do, allowing us to kind of become who we want to become, like us decide what we really and truly want and who we want to be.
Yeah.
And and it's like God recognizes that there's a risk in this, and there is real risk. We like see it all around us, right?
Mhm.
Even with the best of intentions, this agency that we have often goes awry, and
Well, I
we've
mean,
heard.
I can put a horse in a pasture, and it can use its agency to run around in that pasture, and it also can fall into a groundhog hole and break its leg.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Like, yeah.
And so it's yeah, I don't know, it's like I feel like in some sense the creation is so wonderful that it is it like taxes God to the very limits. Even though we talk about like a God who's infinite, like I think whatever he put himself to in the task of creation is like to those very limits and beyond. um and I think that's some of why we have this silence, and we're intended to fill that in with something, you know.
Yeah, like you you have a little guy right now, um and I'm sure you've experienced some of this already, but there's always these moments with your children where, you know, you spend a lot of time instructing them, right? Whether it's verbally or, you know, helping them to imitate you or whatever it is, but it's all instruction. And it's because you love them and you want them to be able to navigate the world, right? So you're giving them all the tools that you can possibly think of at whatever stage of development that they're in. But then there's also a moment when they're struggling to do something that you have to just stand by and watch,
Mhm.
right? And be silent. Because it's in the struggling that they learn the thing, you know. Like I can think about teaching my granddaughter to knit, and I'm just like, I just want to get in there and, you know, your finger has to go here, you know. But her hands and her brain have to work in tandem, and that takes
Yeah.
time, right? And the muscle memory has to be, those connections have to be made, and in order for it to happen, and at some point she can do it without looking, you know, but getting there is the really hard part, and I can't help her do that, right?
Yeah.
And then I have to just be silent. I have to be there in case she has a question, basically, right? Like, I don't get this, or, you know, whatever, or encourage her, you know, that you're fine. It'll be fine. I remember years ago writing a little thing about God's silence, the silence that is kind of the heavy silence between the Old Testament and the New Testament, you know. And I had this idea that, you know, God was finally like, okay, all right, we've been running, you know, we've been doing this thing in the desert, you know, and you've been just messing up, and I've been fixing all your mistakes, and, you know, and telling you how much I love you, and then telling you again, and telling you, you know, and now silence, right? And I'm sure that there must have been people who were just lamenting the silence, like, where is God, right? Where is he? He's abandoned us. I've heard those stories from people who've been through the Holocaust, novels about the Holocaust, you know.
Yeah.
Where is God? I think a lot of Jews lost their faith because of the Holocaust.
Yeah,
Because of
even today, like a very large percentage of, well, I don't know if it's a large percentage, but like there's a lot of people in the state of Israel that they've moved to Israel,
and
but
they're done.
they don't.
I think I might have this wrong. I think Jacob mentioned this once on the Discord, but something like the Jewish Reformed movement kind of resulted out of that pain from the Holocaust, right? Where they were just like, why even bother with all this stuff,
Mhm.
you know? But they didn't want to give up their faith or their heritage or their ethnic, you know, their identification as a group of people. So, but
Yeah, even people over there that aren't necessarily, you know, believers in any meaningful sense, they might describe themselves as atheists. A lot of them still will keep kosher and things like that. Like,
yeah, because it's their ancestors. It's ancestral. Yeah. But I always imagine God saying, okay, you know, you were, I waited on you all this time, you know, since the fall. I've been waiting on you. And now you can wait on me, you know, and see. And I see that as a excuse me. I see that as a positive thing, because you know, at my stage of the game here, you know, when I was younger, I was very impetuous. I was very impulsive. I couldn't wait for anything. I could hardly wait for Christmas, mostly because I wanted to give people things, you know. And so in order to assuage my own temptation to give people things early, I would buy them at the last minute, So I could actually just give them right away,
Yeah.
Um, yeah, and I've learned that one of the greatest gifts to have, as a Christian, for me, in my relationship to God, is to wait. And that actually means silence, because there's nothing to say, right? When you're waiting. Like, your doctor doesn't come out every 5 minutes and say, I'll be right with you. When you're in the waiting room, right? You're just waiting. And eventually you're going to get called and you're going to go in. But there's nothing to say while you're waiting. There's no conversation to be had. This is what we're doing. We're waiting. And then you wait. And then there's this element of eager anticipation, I think, that follows, which is a movement of faith, right? I mean, you could wait and despair. You could wait like someone in Auschwitz and say, where is God? I'm waiting, God, I'm waiting, and just fall into despair because it's just so horrific, right? Or you could wait with eager anticipation, knowing that whatever happens, like I said at the beginning of this conversation, God is good, right? And no matter what, even if I die, even if I'm tortured, even if I starve to death, even if I watch my children die, yeah. I've learned a lot in having to wait. And I think that was, because that was my biggest problem for most of my life, that was the most important lesson that God taught me. And it wasn't pain-free, Michael. It was very, very painful. But
I think it seems like there's no learning without pain.
No,
like nothing is ever really yours until it's painfully impressed itself in your core.
Yeah. There's some kind of fusion, like, that happens between the mind and the body, right? That makes something real. This is why propositions often just fly over my head. Like sometimes they go so high or so quickly that I can't even hold on to them, but when I turn my back on my ram and he slams me into a barbed wire fence, I never turn my back on my ram again. You know what I'm saying? If someone says, and I read, don't turn your back on a ram. I read that. It was a proposition that I didn't take very seriously. And I'm just grateful that we didn't break my kneecap or something in the meet, But yeah, there's this interesting, this is why I have my body question, right? Because there's this, what do you call that, synthesis that's so important to our learning process between the mind and the body.
Mm-hmm.
Like our body is like a pincushion, basically. It's really soft and really fragile, right? It's our mind that can be inflexible.
Mm-hmm.
But our body is never so. And when our body is damaged, our mind has to come alongside. It really has to change, right? And God has given us a body. And I know I asked this question, and I know nobody knows what I'm asking because they never give me the right answer. Not the one I'm looking for anyway. And I think I'm just slowly figuring it out by myself. Why this body? why this body, God, um,
Why body at all, or why this particular body, or?
well, I think it's both. Why a body? Why this particular body? This fragile, body that experiences. I mean, I stepped on some dry grass the other day in my bare feet, and I got a little tiny piece of grass in my foot, in my heel, which is like leather, because I'm barefoot most of the time. And man, did that hurt. I was just like, what the heck? Why do I have to feel this?
Yeah.
What's going on here? It's my heel. It's going to close over and it's like calloused and thick. Why does this have to keep hurting? And I'm sure if I was diagnosed with cancer, I'd say the same thing.
Yeah.
Why does this have to be, right?
Yeah, it's well, I think you pulled on something important, because I think that's when it bothers us the most, is when it feels like the pain has no purpose.
Right.
That's the hardest to take.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, that's the moral and ethical dilemma of this story that we're in, right? Is pain and the suffering. That's really the thing. I was talking to Jess the other day about it, because I mean, I don't know why I never thought of it before. Jess was like, yeah, I know that.
Know what?
Made a big discovery, eh? But I said to him, oh, wait a minute, like Origen talks about, the scripture says body, soul, and spirit. And he talks about us as, or, that we have body, soul, and spirit, that there are, literal, moral, and spiritual lessons to be learned in the Bible. And he makes those, he makes those equivalent to the body, the soul, and the spirit. But then I saw, oh, wait, okay, creation is like the literal, Job is like the moral, ethical, and Revelation is like the spiritual versions of the same story. Right? You have these body, soul, and spirit actually right in there.
Which one's the soul?
Job. The
Joel's
moral
the soul.
and ethical. The moral
Body
and
ethical is Genesis.
Yeah. The literal. Yeah. And then you have the cosmic, spiritual version of the same story in Revelation, right?
That's interesting.
Yeah. Yeah. And the other idea that I had out of that was, when God says to Job, look at the ostrich. She lays her eggs and then forgets about them, but look how beautiful she is, right? Mm-hmm. I thought, oh, that's Christ. In what the wisdom of God seems like foolishness to men, right? That's what that is. That's what that is. That's Christ. He looks like a fool, but look at how beautiful he is.
Yeah, I mean, it's just I mean, for you, like, how do you connect this to, because you were talking about earlier, I want to take this back to like what we were talking about with femininity at the beginning, and how for you that leads to a groundedness.
Yeah.
How does that fit in with all this? Because I wanted this conversation to be less propositional, but like my tendency is always to push that way. Even when I was telling the story about The Chosen, and for me it's very emotional, I feel like I immediately sidestep the emotion and kind of propositionally diffuse the emotional bomb, which I don't want to do, but yet I'm so practiced at doing it that I do it anyway.
Yeah.
But I mean, how do we get back to
The groundedness.
connecting these things? Yeah, because it seems like,
Well, I think actually the emotion is a really good indicator that connection is made.
mhm.
That's what evokes. It's kind of like a strike of lightning, you know. I mean, we when we see lightning, it comes from above and hits the ground. Actually, it's the other way around, but that's what it looks like, and that's good enough for now, right? And of course, when that happens, there's a strong chemical, physiological, or physics based reaction, right? There's a burning and an exploding and a crackling, and a friend of mine actually at the end of our driveway, there was a big dead fir tree years ago, and he was helping us fencing, and he was leaving, driving his truck, and he got to the end of our driveway, and this tree was right across the road, and right in front of him, lightning hit it. And this tree was probably like 300 years old. It was massive, and it was dead, so it didn't have any. He could see the lightning go the whole length of the tree.
Wow.
And it spiraled like this, right around,
Wow.
right to the top. And he said suddenly, like log-sized pieces of wood just flew into the air and landed all over the road where this lightning spiraled its way up, you know?
That's so cool.
And yeah, really, really cool. And that's what happens when connections are made. Things explode, they catch on fire, you know. And I think that's why we have emotional responses. I see it a lot. Often I can discern what it is that was connected to. Not always. I have to know the person well enough. But you know, it's that is when heaven meets earth, in my opinion, right?
I think that's something about that's related to that body question.
Yeah,
It's something about
definitely.
our role as mediators between those two realities. Somehow
Yeah,
the body is a method of compressing those things together somehow.
I remember thinking or being struck by Peterson's observation about a sense of awe and how it's actually a bodily reaction. I thought that was really interesting because to me, it felt like that's where, you know, like when you see something and you're in awe of it, your hair stands on end. You get goosebumps. Like you actually have a physical reaction to this, right? And at the time I thought of it as being plugged into something super sensible, let's say. But in simpler terms, it's a heaven meeting earth.
Yeah.
Right? And in box terms, it would be like when the super sensible comes crashing in, or the second coming of Christ, as Origen describes it, right? In that quote that I posted the other day. It's all that, you know. And that is mediated by the spirit, I think, which is, I'm learning, dare I say, the divine feminine, right? You know, one of the things that, and you know, like I don't know much about this, honestly. I haven't even read much about it, but the one thing, if I look at Mary, the Theotokos, I understand one thing, and that is that her role was to receive something and to bear it. So in many ways, right? Like she received the seed and she bore the child. She received the news and she pondered it in her heart. She bore it, right? She didn't tell anyone. of her concerns, right? She kept them, she bore them. And I think this gets to your whole idea of silence too, Michael. Because, you know, when I was talking to CW the other night, I said something like, you know, I'm just realizing that for millennia, babies grew in secret, right? We couldn't see in. And it was silent, couldn't hear them, you know. We didn't know what was happening. It was this closed in sacred secret thing, right? And I mean, that is part of the divine feminine, I think, obviously, right?
Yeah. Yeah. The hiddenness.
Yeah. And you know, that doesn't mean that it stays hidden, because the child is eventually brought into the world, right? The thing is born. It comes when it's time. And then this goes to this whole idea of waiting patiently in the silence, you know, again, right? Some things need to be gestated, I think.
Yeah. Well, probably anything meaningful. And it seems to me like the propositional layer can be sort of a means of aborting the baby by
Yeah.
by trying to sort of bypass and shortcut a lot of the pain that and just like you were saying that the both the long gestational period, but also just all the discomfort and the inconvenience that that comes along with the process.
And the impatience
Yeah.
for it, right? There's a lot of that too. But that's interesting what you said about aborting, because I also think that there is the chance that the baby can be born too soon and it's underdeveloped.
Mm-hmm.
And it can't really survive on its own. And then, and I'm just gonna throw this in here.
I think, and the propositional can play a big part of that as well.
Well, that can be
forcing it to come too soon.
Right. That, like, I think that's where the propositional can be dangerous, actually, right? To that process, because then you have to prop up things, right? You lay out this propositional thing, and it can't survive on its own, and then around it you have to prop it up with all these arbitrary, you know, things that you decide will keep it alive, basically. And we see that in a lot of theologies, right? I'm not going to name the one that shouldn't be named. But there, you know, I think that's a pretty good descriptor, actually.
Yeah. Yeah, I don't, you know, with that thing, you know, I don't even necessarily see it as a theology. Because I think, well, I mean, I think there's an intellectualized component of it, but I think
Yeah.
my experience with it is something much different.
Yeah. Well, yeah,
like it's much more internalized, because for me,
yeah,
I never have ascribed to a lot of those ideas, but somehow I've been living by them nevertheless. And even now, where I say, oh, I recognize here's this sort of thing that's had quite a bit of influence in my life, and how do I get rid of it? It's not so easy. Like intellectually, you know, I'm convinced of a lot of these, you know, of the of what is the word, the how dangerous and how corrupting this thing is. But just getting it doesn't mean I can just kind of wave my hand and get rid of it, because it's like it's much more of an embodied thing that gets that I carry around. And I find, you know, it's there even at times when, you know, I feel like it yeah, it's just surprising to me just to where it has its tentacles,
Yeah, but
because it is hidden. It's hidden. It's implicit.
it's absorbed by through osmosis. That's how I like to think about it.
Mhm. And there's still parts of me that conceive of it as a sort of something good, like something like, okay, this is a way of protecting myself from hubris, from overstepping my bounds, from getting too big for my britches, for
Mhm.
um um all these things, right? Or like
Yeah.
and yeah, and so I think, for me personally, like if I looked at like where I tend to make mistakes, it's often mistakes of omission rather than commission,
Mhm.
right? Where like there's an opportunity to do something, and my um, hesitancy, or my trying to propositionally get all my ducks in a row before I take the first step, is what seems to be like more of an issue. And I think that desire for certainty, that desire, um, that the idea that something has to be perfect before it has value,
Yeah.
definitely definitely is framed by all of this.
Mhm. Mhm. Yeah. Yeah. And I mean, perfect is boring.
Yeah, but I think that's related to that, what you were saying about the propositional language, because I think
Yeah.
that there's something about propositional language where like it places a very high emphasis on precision and exactness.
It's like 1960s and 70s architecture
Mhm.
to me.
And I think a lot of times, when it comes to like people who use big words and things like that, oftentimes it's kind of really just a way also of, you know Luke likes to use the term word schlongs, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
But it is a sort of like dick measuring contest, right? Of
Yeah.
like,
It is.
oh, mine's this big.
Yeah.
What do you want to do with that? And it is a way of kind of pushing people out of the way and being like,
Yeah.
yeah, if you don't have something at least that big or bigger, go home,
Yeah.
because you can't be a part of this conversation.
Yeah. And
Or
I think you said that yesterday in our conversation with Nate, how people are really there's a status hierarchy of with intellect being at the top, right? So that makes it even more appealing.
yeah,
I thought about that for a while actually after you said that, and I thought, what counters that? What counters putting intellect at the top? Like, or is there a counter to that? Um,
I think that, I mean, like for me, I mean, it's just reality, like reality and real pain and suffering, always just cripples that inclination because you realize
yeah,
just how hollow and desiccated and fragile those constructions of the mind are.
yeah.
Um, within a very limited sphere, they look very pretty, and it seems to be evidence of moral rectitude, and all these, like this kind of icon of everything wonderful and lovely, but it doesn't survive contact with any sort of
Essentially,
pain and
yeah.
suffering.
Essentially, it's a dead end.
Yeah.
That's what it is. That gets you nowhere. It just gets you nowhere. Yeah.
Well, yeah, it can be like, it can be useful, right? It can be the map that kind of gives you a jumping off place to do make some real progress, but much more often it becomes very self-referential. So you're kind of like,
Yeah.
you get into a room that you're you're always going to go around in circles in, because he
Well, when
sort
you
of,
were talking about it, I had this memory came to mind. I was hitchhiking with my sister, and we didn't have a map. Like we were just like, Canada doesn't have a lot of roads, to be honest. So we got on this highway and we just assumed it was one that stretches right across the country. And so we started hitchhiking. We didn't know what direction we were going in, north, south, east, west, it didn't matter. We just wanted to go somewhere. And what we were on was a highway that had a dead end. Okay. It went to a town. It was a long stretch of highway, but it went to this little tiny forestry town, the mill. And we got there and there was nothing there. Like, it was a post office and a general store and nothing. We were like, oh, okay, we got to get out of here. So we crossed the street basically and started back the other way. Well, it took us 3 days to get out of that town because nobody in that town left, and half the vehicles that would drive past us were on our way to work at the mill just down the road. We were just like, oh my God, we're never going to get out of here. So sometimes propositional conversations can be like that, right? They'll take you somewhere.
Yeah.
But it's not really anywhere.
They very easily get looped in a sort of disconnect from reality, where it's like, oh no, I'm pointing at reality. And you're like, oh really? It looks to me like just another abstraction over here that we're pointing at. And you can kind of get caught in that. It's especially when you have high regard for the intellect and these abstract, modes of being. And so, you can,
this is one of the things that I've thought about, even just in our conversations with each other on the Discord. I've thought, going back to the whole idea of language and how to make it magic. And I thought, well, there's only one thing that makes it magic, and that's stories, poetry, right? That's magic language. And so if I can't speak in those terms, then sometimes that's all I do is just find a really good story and post it.
Yeah.
Because
I think just telling your own story.
Or telling your own. Yeah.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
It's
that's for sure.
You've already got all the, the rhythm and everything to make music with that, and turn it into magic. And I mean, I think, Paul's little project in terms of like how, there's this whole community of people that now interact with each other. I think it's mostly about that, the fact that it was a platform where his, desire to connect with people and hear their personal story created a space for, real compassion and community, and just became a model that other people followed that, it's impressive, and there, what part of what he's doing is it's that feminine act of, silence. He listens, in a particular way with a particular focus with the intent of allowing something to kind of be born.
Right. Yeah. And that eager anticipation, right? That it will be. This is the thing.
And that no matter what it is, it's good. Like I think that's the thing for me that was really powerful. It's like, it didn't matter who he was talking to about what subject. Like he was just very excited to hear whatever they said. And, it was, whatever they said was gold to him.
Yeah.
And you can say to some extent, he's just a pastor. He's just good at acting, but like, no, it was definitely something deeper and more embodied that you could, actually, I think gave a lot of people who ordinarily may have not had any points in their lives where they actually would engage in something like that, were able to do it.
Right.
And, that was impressive.
Yeah. Yeah, no, that the power of that, of what Paul did in conversations with people, the power in that has been tremendous. I mean, that's why we're having a conversation right now.
Exactly.
And yeah, it's multi-layered, right? It's about that silence. It's about communion. It's about relationship. It's about forgiveness and love and everything, you know. Yeah, and it's sustained itself. It's sustaining it, and it sustains all at the same time.
Yeah, it's the seed for the plant that's going to grow up and make new seed.
Yeah, exactly. I have to go soon, but
Yeah, I probably should run and check on what my wife and kid are up to.
yeah. One thing though, I was thinking maybe we could do another one of these, Michael, because I don't know, there were some things about language that that kind of jotted down, like I like, what is truth? I know it's a huge question. And then language as propaganda and language as poetry,
Okay.
how do you go from the one to the other? And I'm thinking specifically of, I made some voxes the other day about talking about things that you don't want to, that shouldn't be talked about. And Nate had been saying that he doesn't want to give power to anything, right? And how when things are at the top of the social media hierarchy, then are you really actually saying anything new, or are you just regurgitating things? So how can you not do that? Because I think that there has to be a path through all of that, right? And then the other thing that I thought about too to talk about was veiling and unveiling in parables, and when is it, when like Jesus didn't have any problem saying things that people didn't understand, and I do. Okay.
Yeah.
Like I'm like, no, they
too.
need to know what I'm saying. They need to know. And I'm like, okay, how do I put myself in a place where it's okay to say the thing and just let it go out there and see what happens,
Yeah, I think it's part of that is you're exactly right. That's that need for us to understand or to feel understood is something of this misapprehension of what language is and what it's supposed to be doing.
Yeah. And you've got a lot more actually, idea of Barfield and stuff like that. So I don't know. I have those little things written down. I can send them to you, but I thought maybe we could make this as long as we have something to say, like an ongoing discussion.
I'd be happy to do that.
Okay.
This speaking of Barfield, this is, I know you've read Saving the Appearances, but this is it's a tiny little book, and I've actually done some readings of this I could share with you if you want to dive into it, because it's really short and compressed. But I think I feel like he wrote this after a long time of being misunderstood on these things, so it's a little, I think it's more clear, at least for me.
Maybe I'll just order it and read it. Got such a snack beside me here. It's pathetic. But I finished Hierarchy of Heaven and Earth the other day, so I just
nice.
felt like cracking a champagne bottle. Yeah. I think I'm going to crack open Rolling in Moonlight because I've got a few, my Michael Martin books don't arrive till the 17th.
Yeah.
I couldn't get them on the Canadian Amazon. I had to order them from the American one.
Interesting.
Yeah. There was one on the Canadian Amazon, but I thought, well, I'm not going to order one from there. And it was actually more expensive than the one on the American one. So I just ordered them both. But yeah, maybe I thought, did you order Rolling in Moonlight by any chance?
I have it. I have so many books. I have it on Kindle. So.
Okay. Because I'm really up for just a fictional jaunt through Fantasyland. Like I really need something like that right now. And I'm kind of hoping that Roland will do both, you know, do that for me. So yeah. Well, it's been a pleasure.
Yeah, same here. I'll end the recording here.